Today, I bring you a charming new mystery featuring none other than the brilliant Hercule Poirot, the world's most famous Belgian detective, created by Agatha Christie. This case is filled with twists, clever clues, and Poirot's signature little grey cells at work. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now let's get started. It was one of those tranquil London afternoons when the city, exhausted from a week of activity, seemed to rest beneath a blanket of springtime calm. I found myself once more seated across from my old friend Hercule Poirot in his immaculate flat at Whitehaven Mansions. The little Belgian sat, as always, perfectly composed, legs crossed, a silver moustache glinting in the sunlight as he stirred his tisane with maddening precision. "Tea, Hastings?" he asked, arching an eyebrow, as if the offer were a test of character. "Don't mind if I do," I replied, taking the cup with gratitude, though I must admit I rather miss a proper English brew. "Ah, you and your English breakfast." Poirot sighed dramatically. "It is too bitter. It lacks finesse. You must learn, mon ami, to appreciate the subtlety of herbal balance." I chuckled and let him have his victory. As always, he delighted in these small debates over national taste and character. The topic of conversation had drifted from an article in the Times about declining civility in modern society to Poirot's disdain for the current fashion of wearing wide-legged trousers, when I happened to mention, quite casually I thought, the recent resurgence in amateur photography among the upper classes. "Oh, yes," I said, stretching out my legs. "You wouldn't believe it, Poirot. At the garden party I attended last week at Withers Hall, nearly every guest had a camera slung around their neck. One might have mistaken the affair for a press conference." Poirot raised a fastidious brow. "Mon Dieu, the British aristocracy playing at being les journalistes." "Well, one of them, a rather spirited young lady named Dorothy Painswick, even offered to take a group portrait, said she was experimenting with light and framing, whatever that means. She seemed terribly proud of the results." Poirot tapped his teaspoon twice against his cup. "It is curious, Hastings. When people seek to capture a moment forever, they often reveal more than they intend. One must ask, what do they hope to preserve? And what do they hope to conceal?" I had no reply for that. At the time, I thought it merely another of his cryptic musings. I could not yet know how much weight his words would soon carry. Later that afternoon, as I fumbled through my satchel in search of my notebook, I came across the photograph in question. It was a glossy black and white print, recently delivered by post. I offered it to Poirot, somewhat absent-mindedly. "Here, it just arrived this morning, the group portrait I told you about. Not bad, I think, considering it was taken by an amateur." Poirot took the photograph delicately, as if it were a rare manuscript. He studied it with interest, tilting it this way and that to catch the light. The image depicted a semicircle of people standing in front of a great elm tree on the manicured lawns of Withers Hall. Colonel Withers stood proudly in the centre, his military moustache bristling, with his much younger wife Eleanor seated beside him. To their left was Edgar Molyneux, the late financier, looking as if he had been caught mid-thought. Dorothy Painswick beamed behind the camera stand, while Charles Molyneux, Edgar's son, stood off to one side, arms folded. Poirot squinted and drew the photograph closer. "But what is this, Hastings?" he murmured, tapping the lower left corner with a neatly manicured finger. "Regardez, there, beneath the elm." I leaned in, peering at the background. At first I saw nothing. Then, gradually, a vague, blurred figure seemed to emerge from the shade of the tree. It was little more than a silhouette, a shape in the periphery, but it was undoubtedly human. "Curious," I muttered. I don't recall anyone standing there when the photograph was taken. Indeed, Poirot murmured. You are certain? I'd swear to it. I was watching Dorothy adjust the camera. The only people nearby were already posing. Poirot sat back in his chair, lips pursed. He did not speak for a moment. A shadow, he said finally. Perhaps it is nothing, a trick of light. Or perhaps, Hastings, it is something that should not have been captured. Something inconvenient. I frowned, sensing that familiar gleam in his eye, the one that meant his grey cells had begun their quiet work. We spent the next half hour discussing the photograph, yet Poirot's interest seemed to cool almost as quickly as it had flared. He examined the image with his little magnifying glass, peered at the edges, and even turned it upside down, as if expecting a clue to tumble out. It is nothing, perhaps, he said at last, placing the photograph gently on the side table. A fault in the development process. These amateurs, they do not always understand the precision required in the photographic arts. I was not convinced. But surely, Poirot, that figure, blurred or not, was standing there. Possibly, he said, waving a hand dismissively. But let us not be too quick to assign mystery to every smudge. In the age of photography, even shadows are given form where none exist. He stood and adjusted his cuffs, seemingly prepared to move on from the matter entirely. Come, Hastings, let us not allow ourselves to be haunted by phantoms on paper. And yet, as he passed by the window, I noticed him glance back at the photograph with a flicker of unease. It was gone in an instant, but I saw it. Poirot? Yes, mon ami? You don't really think it's just a photographic flaw, do you? He paused. Then, in his usual theatrical murmur, replied, I think, Hastings, that sometimes the shadow tells more of the story than the subject. Little did I know. Those words would come back to me in ways I could never have expected. It was just past 5 o'clock when a sudden, urgent knock interrupted our quiet domesticity. Poirot, seated by the fireplace arranging his patent leather shoes in perfect alignment beneath the hearth, glanced at me with raised eyebrows. Who, I wonder, calls at such an hour without an appointment? He mused, already rising. Before I could answer, our landlady, Mrs. Pearson, ushered in a tall, barrel-chested gentleman, whose very bearing screamed military. He removed his hat with an abrupt motion and revealed a weathered face streaked with worry. Colonel Archibald Withers, he said gruffly. Apologies for the intrusion, Monsieur Poirot, but I was told you're the man to see when matters take an unexpected turn. Indeed, you have been correctly informed, Colonel, Poirot replied smoothly. Please, sit. What has occurred to disturb a man of your discipline? The Colonel sat stiffly, his eyes darting toward the photograph still lying on the side table. His jaw tightened. It's about Edgar. Edgar Molyneux Poirot and I exchanged a glance. The name was familiar, of course. Edgar had been one of the guests in the garden party photo. He's dead, Withers said bluntly. Found in his study this morning. Gunshot wound. Everyone's calling it suicide, but... His voice faltered, not from emotion, but from the sheer gravity of uncertainty. I see, Poirot said softly, steepling his fingers. And yet you do not believe he took his own life. I don't know what to believe, Withers muttered. Only that before he died, he left a letter, and it mentions a shadow from the past. Poirot did not respond at once. His eyes drifted slowly toward the photograph once more. Colonel Withers reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, aged only by the trembling hand that had written it. Poirot took it delicately, unfolded the sheet, and read it in silence. The letter was brief, oddly so. A mere paragraph in Edgar Molyneux's distinct, slanted handwriting. I fear I cannot outrun the shadow any longer. It has followed me from the past, silent and patient. If anything should happen to me, Know that it was no accident. Some debts are paid not in money, but in silence. I admit, the words gave me a slight chill. There was something haunting in their vagueness, like a man whispering to himself in the dark. Poirot read them twice, his brow furrowed in concentration. He feared someone, Poirot said slowly. Someone who knew him well enough to wait, and well enough to be feared. Colonel Withers gave a solemn nod. That's why I came. Everyone else is content to call it a tragedy and move on. But I know Edgar. He wasn't the sort to give up. Poirot rose silently and walked over to the side table where the photograph still rested. He feared the shadow, Poirot murmured. Perhaps, Colonel, the shadow is not only metaphorical. Poirot picked up the photograph once more, this time with renewed precision. His expression, previously casual, had sharpened into something I recognized all too well, the spark of his little grey cells awakening. He examined the blurred figure beneath the elm with surgical attention, eyes narrowing as he tilted the photograph toward the light. There, he murmured. The angle of the light, the position of the sun. Hastings, do you recall what time the photograph was taken? Shortly after 3, I believe, I said. Dorothy waited until the shadows fell just right. Poirot nodded, tapping the edge of the photo. And yet this shadow, see how it stretches. Too long for that hour, too sharp in outline. It is not natural. It is posed. Posed? I said, baffled. Surely a trick of the eye. Non, mon ami. It is the only part of the image that does not belong, which means, naturally, it may be the only truth within it. He turned to Colonel Withers. Colonel, I must impose upon you a small request. I should like to visit Withers Hall at once. The Colonel blinked. You believe there's more to this than a photograph? Poirot's eyes glinted. Oh, mais oui. The photograph is only the beginning. The next morning, with the sun filtering weakly through a veil of grey clouds, Poirot and I boarded the early train from Paddington. Our destination, Withers Hall, an imposing country estate nestled amidst the rolling greenery of Kent. The journey was swift and, for the most part, uneventful. Save for Poirot's insistence on rearranging the placement of our teacups on the table to achieve what he referred to as visual equilibrium. Order, Hastings, he said, tapping his spoon delicately against the saucer. Even in the smallest of things, it is the mirror of the mind, and in this matter, I sense disorder masquerading as order. I wasn't entirely sure what he meant, but I had long ago learned not to interrupt him when he was philosophizing. Besides, we had arrived. Withers Hall was every bit the picture of a traditional English estate. A wide gravel driveway curled in front of the main house like a coiled ribbon. Ivy clung to the stone facade, and the lawn, though impeccably maintained, seemed subdued, as if the property itself sensed the cloud of death that hung overhead. Colonel Withers greeted us at the front door, his stern face a few shades more pallid than when we'd last seen him. He ushered us inside with minimal ceremony. I appreciate your coming, Monsieur Poirot, he said in that clipped military tone of his. There's a great deal of gossip already, and I'd prefer we get ahead of it. Gossip is like the smoke from a gun, Colonel, Poirot replied. It spreads, but rarely reveals who pulled the trigger. We passed through the grand foyer, decorated with ancestral portraits and an unnecessarily large suit of armour, and were led down a corridor that seemed to grow darker with each step. A footman opened a pair of tall double doors, revealing the study where Edgar Molyneux had met his end. Poirot paused at the threshold, his eyes scanning the room with a painter's attention to shadow, space, and shape. And here, he murmured, the stage is set, n'est-ce pas? Now let us see whether it was truly tragedy or theatre. The study was cool and silent. with the faint scent of furniture polish and something subtler beneath it. Perhaps old tobacco, or the ghost of cologne. A single window let in grey light, casting faint reflections off the polished surface of the mahogany desk. The chair behind it was turned slightly, as if someone had just stood. The scene, to my eyes, looked ordinary enough. A revolver lay neatly at the edge of the desk, beside a half-filled glass of whiskey and an inkwell. A blotter sat perfectly aligned, and a paper knife gleamed beside a closed book. Poirot, however, saw more than I ever could. He moved slowly about the room like a dancer on a stage, pausing now and then to tilt a lamp, examine a rug, or scrutinize the dust along the edges of a windowsill. "It is too neat," he said at last. "Neat?" I repeated. "Well, Edgar Molyneux was a fastidious man by all accounts." "Ah, but death is not," Poirot replied. "It arrives with a stumble, a scuffle, a final struggle. Even in suicides there is the chaos of the last emotion. Here, there is none." He picked up the revolver delicately with his handkerchief, inspecting the barrel and grip. "Fired once," he observed, "and wiped clean. Curious." "What do you make of the whiskey?" I asked. Poirot sniffed the glass but did not taste it. "Untouched, likely staged. The question, mon ami, is not what is present, but what is absent." He turned to the fireplace and knelt. In the grate were grey ashes, undisturbed. "Nothing was burned recently," he muttered. "No letter, no farewell." He rose and looked about the room once more. It is like a hotel room left tidy by the maid, not the scene of a man's final moment. The footman returned with a nod. "Everyone's gathered in the drawing room, sir." "Excellent," said Poirot. "But first, Hastings, I wish to speak with the master of the house. There are things one only learns from the tone of a man's voice." I followed him out of the study, increasingly aware that what we had seen was not the end of a man's story, but the beginning of a performance. Colonel Withers led us to his private study, a more modest space than Edgar's, with fewer trappings of wealth, but more character. A sabre hung behind the desk, and a model of a Royal Navy cruiser rested beside a polished clock that ticked with military precision. He poured himself a brandy, but didn't offer one to us. "I'll get to the point," he said gruffly, settling into a worn leather armchair. Edgar was a complicated man, but I never expected this. Poirot sat opposite, legs crossed, his hands resting on the arms of the chair as if presiding over a board of inquiry. "You say you were asleep at the time of the incident, Colonel?" "Yes," he replied. "Retired around 10:30. Didn't hear the shot, oddly enough." "Strange," Poirot murmured. "It was a revolver, yes? One would expect such a sound to carry." "Withers Hall is large," he said, defensive, "and my quarters are on the opposite wing." "Still," Poirot said gently, "you were the host. Did you observe anything unusual before that hour?" The Colonel hesitated. Edgar seemed nervous, distracted. He'd been out of sorts all week. Did he say why? No. He sipped his brandy. And frankly, I didn't pry. Edgar was the sort to keep his troubles to himself. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And what of your wife, Colonel?" Did she know Edgar well? The question caught Withers off guard. He cleared his throat. They'd met a few years back, before Eleanor and I married, but it was brief, harmless. Poirot did not press further, but I noticed the glint in his eye had returned. "Merci, Colonel," he said, rising. "One must start at the perimeter before approaching the centre." As we stepped out of the room, Poirot whispered to me, "He is a man who guards secrets, Hastings." And secrets are the first cracks in a perfect story. We found Mrs. Eleanor Withers in the rose garden, seated on a stone bench with a book unopened in her lap. A soft breeze played with the ribbon at her collar, and though she smiled at our approach, There was a weariness in her eyes that the morning sun could not dispel. Poirot bowed deeply. Madame, I beg your pardon for the intrusion. I hope we do not disturb your moment of reflection. Not at all, Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice soft but clear. Colonel Withers told me you might wish to speak with everyone. I rather expected it. Ah, Poirot smiled gently. Then I shall take only a little of your time. Just a few trifling questions about Monsieur Molyneux, if you please. At the mention of Edgar's name, I noticed a flicker pass across her face. Something between regret and restraint. You knew him well? Poirot asked, watching her closely. We were acquainted before I married my husband, she said after a pause. He was a friend of the family. A close friend, Poirot pressed delicately. She looked away. We were engaged, briefly, years ago. It ended, amicably. But not easily, perhaps, Poirot murmured. Eleanor smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. No ending is ever easy, Monsieur Poirot, especially when pride is involved. Poirot was silent for a moment, then leaned in, his tone lowering. Madame, may I ask, were there circumstances, pressures, which influenced that ending? A long pause followed. Then she said, Let's just say there were things better left unspoken. Such things, Poirot replied softly, have a way of making themselves heard, even after many years. Eleanor Withers rose slowly. If Edgar was in pain, I didn't know, and I wouldn't have wished it for him, truly. Poirot nodded solemnly. Merci, madame. You have been most gracious. As we walked away, I couldn't help but glance back at her figure, still seated among the flowers. She's hiding something, I whispered. Poirot merely said, Oui. But whether it is guilt or sorrow, that is what we must discover. Our next encounter took place in the library, a room of dark wood, thick carpets, and the slightly musty scent of rarely used, leather-bound volumes. Charles Molyneux stood by the window, staring out at the hedges with a brooding intensity. Mr. Molyneux, I said cheerfully, thank you for agreeing to speak with us. He didn't turn around. Didn't have much of a choice, did I? Poirot stepped forward, unbothered. We seek only the truth, monsieur, not accusations. Charles finally turned. He was a tall, lean man in his late 20s, with a hardened jaw and an expression that suggested he'd seen more of the world than most men his age. Or perhaps, more of its disappointment. You'll want to know about my father, he said flatly. Everyone does. Always did, Poirot nodded. It is true, then, that there were tensions between you? Charles laughed, a short, bitter sound. Tensions? We barely spoke, and when we did, it was shouting. He didn't approve of my work, or my opinions, or my choice in friends. And you? Poirot asked. What did you think of him? Charles looked straight at him. I thought he was a cold, controlling bastard who hid behind manners and money. There was silence after that. Poirot did not flinch. And yet, Charles continued, the night before he died, he called me into his study, apologized, said he wanted to make things right. First time he'd said anything kind to me in years. That must have meant something, I offered. It did, but now he's gone. And everyone looks at me like I put the gun in his hand. Poirot tilted his head. Did you, monsieur? Charles's jaw tightened. Number. And I resent the implication. Poirot bowed slightly. Of course. One final question. Where were you at the time of his death? Writing letters. I've been planning a trip abroad, Portugal. Ask anyone. I was in my room all night. As we left, Poirot whispered. He is angry, oui, but beneath the anger something does not align. He speaks of resentment, yet wears guilt. Dorothy Painswick was waiting for us in the drawing room, perched on the edge of an armchair, as if unsure whether to sit or flee. She was a woman in her early 30s, stylish in a modern, artistic sort of way, with sharp features and restless eyes. "Oh," she said when we entered. "I suppose it's my turn now, is it?" Poirot gave a courteous nod. "Mademoiselle Panswick, merci for your patience. It is not an interrogation, merely a conversation." She smoothed her skirt nervously. "It's just all this. It's dreadful. Poor Mr. Molyneux. I never imagined something like this would happen after a simple garden party." Poirot took the seat opposite her. "You were the one who took the photograph, oui?" "Yes," she said. "I've been practicing with a new lens. Edgar encouraged it. He said photography was the art of hidden truths." "Indeed," Poirot smiled thinly. "Did you notice anything unusual that day?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. There was something odd near the elm tree. A shape. I thought it might have been someone walking past, but... She bit her lip. "Well, later that evening, someone asked to see the negatives. They said there was a problem with one of the images, that it might make someone look bad." "Who asked?" She looked away. "I can't say." I promised. Poirot's gaze narrowed slightly. "Sometimes, mademoiselle, a promise made in kindness becomes a shield for cruelty." She shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. "Merci," Poirot said. "You have helped more than you know." As we stepped into the hallway, he murmured, "She has seen something. But it is not her eyes that have failed her. It is her courage." We found Doctor Linley, seated in the conservatory, calmly reading a gardening journal as though nothing had occurred to disturb the routine of Withers Hall. A lean, sharp-featured man in his early 60s, he had the dry precision of someone accustomed to facts and finality. He greeted us with a measured nod, his spectacles glinting in the glass-filtered light. "Ah, Dr. Linley," Poirot said warmly. "We are grateful for a few minutes of your time." "I imagined you'd come round sooner or later," Linley replied coolly, "though I'm not sure what more I can tell you." "You were the first to discover Monsieur Molyneux's body, were you not?" Poirot asked. "Yes. I was taking a stroll around the gardens after midnight and saw the light still on in Edgar's study. Thought it strange. He was usually asleep by 10. When I looked in through the side window, I saw him slumped in the chair. The revolver on the desk told me all I needed." "You did not hear the gunshot?" I asked. He shook his head. "Strangely enough, no, and I have sharp hearing. Must have been muffled." Poirot tilted his head. "And the time, monsieur? When you made this discovery?" "Shortly after midnight. I called the colonel at once." Poirot nodded slowly, then said, almost too casually, "Curious. You say the curtains were drawn back, but according to the footman they were found closed in the morning." Linley blinked just once. "I may be mistaken. It was dark." "Ah," said Poirot softly. "But it is the little details, Doctor, that matter most, especially when the big ones are so convenient." Linley's mouth tightened, but he said nothing further. As we left, Poirot muttered, "A man trained to observe life and death. Yet he confuses a curtain. Non, Hastings. C'est louche." We returned to the drawing room later that afternoon, where Dorothy Painswick had laid out her photography equipment across a polished oak table. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the high windows, lending the moment a kind of theatrical gravitas. Poirot, ever precise, arranged the prints and negatives in a symmetrical fan before settling into the armchair with steepled fingers. "Now, mademoiselle," he said, "let us look together at what the lens has captured and what it has not." Dorothy, visibly nervous, retrieved the original camera and handed over the strip of negatives. "These are the unaltered ones," she said. "The ones I used to develop the print I sent to Mr. Hastings. Poirot slid on a pair of white gloves with exaggerated care. You will forgive me. The oils of the fingers, they interfere with truth. He lifted the negatives, holding them to the light. His gaze was unblinking, clinical, and oddly reverent. Hastings, he said at last. Come, regardez. I stepped beside him and peered at the faint, ghostly images strung along the film. The familiar scene of the group under the elm emerged in miniature. There, he said, tapping one frame with a gloved finger. Do you see it? Indeed, I did. The shadowy figure, far clearer in this negative than in the developed print, stood quite distinctly behind the group, partially obscured by the trunk of the elm tree. But this is different, I said. The figure is much sharper. Exactly, Poirot said, which tells us two things. Firstly, that the original exposure captured the figure in its entirety, and secondly, that someone tampered with the final print to obscure it. Dorothy looked visibly distressed. I didn't do it, I swear. I handed the negatives over to someone who said they would help me retouch the contrast. I thought it was for artistic effect. And who was this someone? Poirot asked gently. She hesitated. Dr. Linley. He said the figure might cause unnecessary questions, that people would invent gossip. Ah, Poirot whispered, and in removing the shadow, he removed the most important detail of all. Poirot studied the negative again, more intensely now. Hastings, he murmured. Note the posture of the figure, the tilt of the head, the stance. It is a man who watches, not merely walks past, and yet he stands slightly off-center, as if avoiding notice. Do you recognize him? I asked. Not yet, he said. But we are closer, mon ami. The shadow, it has shape now. Soon, it shall have a name. He looked again at the blurred figure, then carefully replaced the negatives in their sleeve. Someone went to great lengths to remove this ghost from the image. And why, Hastings? To hide something. Non, Poirot said. To hide someone. A man who belonged to the scene in secret, but not in the light. Dorothy wrung her hands. If I'd known, if I'd understood. You saw too much, Poirot said, his voice like silk over steel. But did not trust what your eyes told you. He stood, eyes glinting. Now we must see what else was removed. As we left the room, Poirot looked over his shoulder and murmured, The photograph is a mirror, Hastings, not of what was posed, but of what escaped the lens of polite society. And that, mon ami, is where the truth lives. We found Eleanor Withers once again in the rose garden, as though the flowers offered her some form of sanctuary from the whispering halls of Withers Hall. She was clipping at a petal with an absent air, her gloves dusted in pollen, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the reach of the manicured hedges. Poirot approached gently, his tone uncharacteristically soft. Madame, he began, I wonder if I might trespass upon your graciousness one more time. She looked up at us, and though she smiled, it was tight and tired. I suppose I should have expected it. Nothing stays buried here, does it? Only the things that wish to be found, Poirot replied cryptically. We seated ourselves beside her, and Poirot continued. You mentioned that you were once engaged to Monsieur Molineux. A past affair, yes? Forgotten, perhaps, but not, I think, without consequence. I ended it, she said quietly, almost too quietly. Not because I stopped caring for him, but because he gave me no choice. Poirot leaned in ever so slightly. Because of something he held over you? Her hand paused over a thorn. Not over me, she said. Over someone else. My father had business ties to Edgar. He threatened to expose a scandal from years ago unless I broke the engagement. He said I was too young to understand what disgrace meant. And so you sacrificed your happiness? Poirot asked gently. She nodded. And he never let me forget it. Even after I married Colonel Withers. Every visit, every conversation. It was as if he relished the power he still had over me. Poirot tilted his head. And did that power grow heavier with time? It turned into something else, she whispered. Regret. Or guilt. I don't know whose it was anymore. Poirot stood slowly. Thank you, madame. You have given me much to consider. As we walked back toward the house, Poirot said under his breath, Love, Hastings, when twisted by leverage, becomes not romance, but ransom. Charles Molyneux was in the billiards room, staring vacantly at a table set for a game no one would play. The cues were perfectly racked and the balls untouched, waiting for action that would never come. He turned as we entered, a look of exhausted defiance in his eyes. I suppose you want to ask if I killed my father, he said flatly. Non, Poirot replied. I am here to ask what you would have lost if he had lived. Charles blinked. What sort of question is that? A very important one, said Poirot. Because, mon cher, motive often lies not in what one gains, but in what one fears to lose. Charles looked away, jaw clenched. He was cutting me off, he said at last. He'd said as much during our last argument. Told me I was a disgrace to the Molyneux name. Called my travels frivolous, my politics juvenile. And yet, Poirot said gently, you stayed. You came to the party. Charles gave a bitter laugh. Because I hoped, just once, he might see me. Not the failure, me. And that night, he did. He asked me into the study. Said he'd made a mistake, that maybe we should talk properly, like father and son. Poirot's eyes sharpened. When did this occur? Just after dinner, before the others went to the drawing room. And how long did you speak? Only a few minutes. I was too stunned to say much. Poirot nodded slowly. And then, I went back to my room and wrote letters. I didn't see him again. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then, softly, It is a curious thing, monsieur. Often, when a man finally speaks truth, he signs his own death warrant. Charles paled. What are you suggesting? Nothing yet, said Poirot. But I begin to wonder if someone overheard your reconciliation and feared what truths might next be spoken. It was after supper that Poirot requested to see Dorothy Painswick once more. She arrived looking anxious, her hands clasped tightly, as though expecting judgment in place of conversation. Miss Painswick, Poirot began, we must speak plainly. Time, as they say, is not our ally. I've already told you everything I know, she said, voice trembling. Non, mademoiselle, Poirot said kindly. You have told us everything you are comfortable admitting, but the truth, la vérité, is rarely comfortable. Dorothy looked down. I didn't want to get involved. No one ever does, he said gently. Yet here we are. She swallowed. I saw someone, that night. Leaving the study. It was late. Close to midnight, I think. I couldn't sleep. I went outside to get some air. I saw the figure coming out through the garden door and slipping away into the hedges. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Did you see who it was? It was too dark. But the figure was tall. Male, I think. He moved like he didn't want to be seen. Why did you not say this before? I thought, what if it was someone with a good reason to be there? I didn't want to stir trouble. And when they said it was suicide, well, I believed them. Poirot stood and paced slowly, his hands behind his back. There is a type of courage, mademoiselle, that does not shout. It whispers. It says, speak, even when it would be easier not to. You have found it today. Dorothy looked close to tears. Do you think it was the killer? I think, Poirot said, that you saw a man leaving the scene of a death. Whether he caused it or merely witnessed it, we must now discover. As we left, Poirot turned to me and said in a low voice, "We now know there was a visitor in the night, and that visitor did not use the front door." Later that evening, Poirot requested another private word with Colonel Withers. We were led once more into his study, a room that seemed even more rigid and masculine under the dim amber glow of the lamps. The colonel stood at attention by the fireplace, as though awaiting a court-martial. "Colonel," Poirot began, "I must ask you a question that may seem indelicate, but I beg you to indulge me. The revolver found beside Monsieur Molyneux, do you recognize it?" Withers narrowed his eyes. "I do." "It is yours, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot asked softly. "Yes," he said after a pause. "A Webley Mark IV. I keep it locked in the drawer of my writing desk." "And was it missing?" Withers hesitated again. "I hadn't checked." "Would you be so kind as to do so now?" Without a word, the colonel crossed the room, unlocked the lower drawer, and opened it. The velvet lining inside was empty. He gave a stiff nod. "It's the same weapon." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "And when was the last time you saw it?" "I don't know. Months ago at least." "Colonel," Poirot said, his tone softening, "you were a military man. You understand the weight of personal responsibility. How would a revolver kept under lock and key in your own study find its way into the hands of a man who died under mysterious circumstances?" I have no idea," Withers said, but his tone lacked conviction. "There are two possibilities, Hastings," Poirot said as we left. "Either the revolver was stolen, or it was given." I frowned. "Do you think Withers could have—" "Non, mon ami, not yet. But if the key was mislaid or duplicated, then perhaps our colonel is guilty of carelessness, and carelessness in a house of secrets is as dangerous as complicity." After a restless night and a damp English morning, Poirot requested that we inspect Edgar Molyneux's study once more. The room remained sealed as it had been, and though the crime scene had been cleared, Poirot moved with methodical precision, as though expecting the room itself to confess. He paused before the fireplace. "You see, Hastings, what strikes me is the absence. This is a man who supposedly left behind a final statement, a cryptic letter, but no second draft, no torn pages, no ashes of discarded thoughts. That is unnatural." He knelt beside the grate and prodded gently at the ashes with the poker. His brow furrowed. "Here, regardez, do you see that edge?" I peered down and saw the corner of something that had survived the flames, just barely. Poirot used tweezers from his little travelling case to extract it. It was a tiny, curled fragment of glossy paper, and on it, unmistakably, was a printed corner, the edge of a sleeve, and the faintest blur of a shadowed figure. "A photograph," I said. Poirot nodded. "Part of one." Dorothy Painswick was called in immediately. Upon examining it, she gasped. "This is from the same roll I developed. It's the same paper stock I use. But I never saw this print." "So someone else developed it," Poirot said. Dorothy's face paled. "Or reprinted it. Someone with access to chemicals, and a reason to make sure it never saw the light of day." I saw Poirot's eyes glint. And what is destroyed, Hastings, is often more telling than what is preserved. He examined the ash again. It was not fully burned. The fire was lit in haste, perhaps by someone nervous or interrupted. "Interrupted?" I echoed. Poirot smiled. "Ah, mon ami, do you not see? If this was the only copy, then its destruction had to be swift. But why burn a photograph unless it showed something one cannot afford to be seen?" "Another shadow?" I asked. He nodded. "Not a trick of the light, but a witness." Poirot's next visit was to the guest wing, where Dr. Linley had taken up temporary residence following the incident. We found him in his room, tying his cravat before a small mirror with practiced indifference. Doctor, Poirot said politely, we have come not to disturb you, but to understand the details that matter most. Linley turned. You suspect me again, do you? Suspect. Non, Poirot said with a smile. I simply do not wish to overlook you. The room was tidy, almost unnaturally so. A black medical bag sat on the writing table, half opened. With quiet formality, Poirot stepped toward it. May I? He asked. Linley gave a short nod. Poirot opened the bag gently and began removing the standard contents: a stethoscope, a folded lab coat, a notebook of patient observations, and a small cloth, soaked faintly in a yellowish tint. Poirot's fingers paused on the cloth. This, he said, is not used in medicine, is it? Linley shrugged. A general cleaning rag. Yet it smells faintly of developer fluid, the type used in darkroom processes. I wouldn't know, Linley said coolly. Perhaps, Poirot said, but you do have a laboratory in your practice, do you not? Linley's face remained unreadable. Of course, it's standard. And perhaps access to photographic chemicals? I imagine so. Poirot folded the cloth neatly and replaced it in the bag. Doctor, you were the one who offered to help Miss Painswick adjust her photograph, did you not? Linley did not respond. It is a curious thing, Poirot said softly, that a doctor with no known interest in photography would take such interest in a photograph, unless he feared what it might show. There was a long silence. Then Linley said, I acted only to prevent scandal. Edgar was a man with enemies. A blurred figure in the background could be misinterpreted. Indeed, said Poirot, but only if that figure was not supposed to be there. As we exited the room, I muttered, he's hiding something. Oui, Poirot said. And do you know what else he hides, Hastings? What? Poirot's smile was razor-sharp. His fear. It leaks from his voice, his silence, even the corners of his bag. By mid-afternoon, I was well and truly baffled. We had spoken to each guest, unearthed hidden romances, bitter resentments, and even tampered photographs, and yet the pieces refused to fall into place. It was like trying to complete a jigsaw with half the edges missing. As Poirot and I sat once more in the drawing room, I gave voice to my frustration. I say, Poirot, this whole business makes no sense. Everyone had a motive, yet nothing adds up. If it was murder, why stage a suicide so meticulously? And if it was suicide, why all this talk of shadows and threats from the past? Poirot, seated opposite me with his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, did not immediately reply. You are thinking too literally, mon ami, he said at last. You look at each suspect as if they hold the solution, but sometimes the truth lies not in what they do, but in what they desperately try not to say. That sounds frightfully cryptic, I muttered. Poirot gave me a small smile. Precisely. He stood and walked to the mantelpiece, gazing into the mirror above it. This case, Hastings, is like a reflection. One cannot rely on what is shown directly. One must consider what has been reversed, distorted, or concealed. I frowned. So the answer lies in what's been hidden. Oui, hidden in plain sight, covered by silence, erased from photographs, burned in fireplaces, muted by shame. He turned back to me, eyes glittering. The truth is not absent, Hastings. It is deliberately removed. And that, mon ami, tells me more than any confession. It was just after supper when the envelope arrived. No name, no return address. Just a plain, ivory-coloured envelope slipped beneath the door of Poirot's guest room at Withers Hall. I found it while fetching his walking stick. Poirot, I said, handing it over, I believe the mail has found you, even in the countryside. He turned it over in his hands, eyes narrowing. Then, without a word, he slit it open with the precision of a surgeon. Inside was a single photograph, glossy, untouched, and sharp. and at the bottom corner, where once there had only been a blur, now stood a distinct, unmistakable figure. The shadow had a face. I leaned over his shoulder and felt a chill run down my spine. It was not a ghost, not a smear, not a trick of the light. It was a man, watching the group from a slight distance, his posture casual, his expression unreadable. But I knew that profile. We both did. "Linley," I whispered. "That's Dr. Linley." Poirot said nothing for a long moment. He studied the photograph as though it were a confession inked in silver nitrate. "Someone wanted us to see this," he said at last. "Someone who no longer wished to be silent." "But who?" Poirot raised a hand. "Not yet. Let us not jump to conclusions. We now have the shadow's identity. What we must learn next is, why was he there?" He turned to me with a gleam of certainty. "And that, mon ami, is where our story truly begins to turn." It was just past 9 when the summons was issued. The guests of Withers Hall, each bearing the marks of tension and unease, filed reluctantly into the grand hall beneath its solemn oil portraits and stern mahogany panels. The air was thick with anticipation and dread. Poirot, in his customary black suit with a pocket square folded to absolute perfection, stood at the hearth as though presiding over a courtroom. I, as ever, hovered nearby, notebook in hand, though I suspected nothing I wrote would be more astonishing than what was to come. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice clear and commanding, "I thank you for joining me. Tonight, we shall lift the curtain on a performance most grave. A man is dead. A truth has been veiled. But now, la vérité shall speak." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Linley leaned against the mantel, arms folded. Charles Molineux paced slightly at the rear. Eleanor Withers sat rigidly upright, and Dorothy Painswick gripped the armrest of her chair as though afraid it might vanish beneath her. Poirot began to walk the room, hands clasped neatly behind his back. "You have all, in your own way, contributed a piece to this puzzle. And I have listened. Oh oui, I have listened most carefully. But it is only when one steps back that the picture becomes clear." He turned sharply toward the hearth. "Tonight, I shall remove, one by one, the shadows cast over this case. And when the last is gone, we shall see who remains in the light." I glanced around at the gathered faces. There was no sound but the ticking of the grandfather clock and the crackle of the fire. Poirot smiled faintly. "Let us begin." Poirot's gaze landed on Eleanor Withers, who met his eyes with an expression of dignified defiance, though her hands betrayed her with their restless fidgeting in her lap. "Madame," Poirot said, "you have lived under a cloud not of your making. A past engagement with the deceased, an abrupt ending, and whispers of scandal, of blackmail, of secrets." Eleanor lifted her chin. "I ended it to protect my family." "Exactly," Poirot replied, his tone softening. "Your father, once entangled in financial impropriety, would have faced ruin had Edgar Molyneux revealed the truth. You sacrificed your happiness to preserve his name." Her eyes shimmered, but she did not blink. "And Edgar never let me forget it." "Non," Poirot agreed. "He held it over you. Not with affection, but with power. And yet you endured it with grace." He turned to the others. "Some might say such bitterness breeds vengeance, but I say no. Madame Withers is many things, but not a murderer." There was a pause. Eleanor drew in a quiet breath, her posture easing ever so slightly. Poirot continued. "She wept not for guilt, but for sorrow, for what was lost long ago, and perhaps for what was never truly hers to reclaim." Charles Molineux shifted in his seat. "Then why all the secrecy? Why not just say it outright?" "Because, monsieur," Poirot said with a faint smile, The past is a wound, and not all wounds heal in the open. Eleanor lowered her gaze. He controlled the narrative, even in death. But no longer, madam, Poirot said. You are free of his hold. It was a rare moment of stillness. Eleanor Withers, once clouded by suspicion, now seemed cast in soft light. Even Hastings, beside me, gave a small nod of approval. One shadow dispelled, Poirot murmured. Let us move to the next. Poirot now turned to Charles Molyneux, who straightened defensively in his chair. Mr. Molyneux, Poirot began, you have been cast, since the moment of your father's death, as the rebellious son, the angry heir, spurned and resentful. I didn't kill him, Charles said quickly. I may have hated him sometimes, but I didn't. Patience, monsieur, Poirot interrupted gently. Let us examine the facts, bien sûr. He pulled from his inner coat pocket a small bundle of neatly folded pages, tied with string. You claimed during the hours of your father's death that you were writing letters. These letters, addressed to a friend in Portugal, were collected from your writing desk. The ink is consistent with that of the estate's stationery, the timestamps on the envelopes verified by the local post office. Poirot held them aloft. They are authentic. A murmur swept the room. Charles exhaled. So you believe me? Poirot nodded. You may have been estranged from your father, monsieur, but in that final conversation, he extended an olive branch. You were given the rare gift of reconciliation, and you, perhaps stunned, perhaps overwhelmed, retreated to your room to process it. I didn't even get the chance to write him back, Charles said quietly. Poirot's voice softened. Number. But that too is a kind of tragedy, and tragedy is not the same as guilt. Dorothy looked toward Charles, sympathy flickering in her expression. Poirot stepped forward. Monsieur Molyneux is not our murderer. He is a young man grieving the loss of something he never fully had, but he is no killer. Charles looked down, his fingers curling slightly. For the first time since our arrival, he seemed truly vulnerable. 2 shadows gone, Poirot said, stepping back to the center of the room. And yet, one remains. The room tensed as if the very walls had leaned in to listen. And this, mes amis, is where the story turns dark. Poirot's next step was toward Dorothy Painswick, who sat nervously at the far end of the room, twisting her bracelet with both hands as if it were a talisman against guilt. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, in every crime, there are those who act, and those who assist unwittingly by omission or misguided loyalty. Tonight, I believe, you will tell us which you were. Dorothy's eyes flicked between Poirot and the envelope in his hand, the one containing the unaltered photograph. I didn't mean to lie, she said at last, voice trembling. I didn't destroy the truth. I only softened it. You developed the group photograph from the garden party, Poirot continued, pacing slowly before her. And then, at someone's request, you removed a figure, blurred perhaps, but undeniably present. Dorothy nodded miserably. I thought it was just a favor. They said the person in the photo didn't want to be seen, that it would stir up unwanted attention. It wasn't until afterward that I wondered if there was more to it. And who asked this favor of you? Her voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Linley. Poirot inclined his head, and he gave you the language of protection, that he wished to prevent scandal, to shield reputations. Yes, she said quickly. And I believed him. I thought I was helping, truly. Poirot's tone remained gentle, but in so doing, mademoiselle, you obscured a witness, perhaps even a killer. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. I swear it. I believe you, Poirot said, but you must also understand. There is no crime so dangerous as the one disguised as kindness. A hush fell over the room. Eleanor looked away, and Charles exhaled slowly. Poirot stepped back to the center. The photograph told a lie, but not your lie. You were used. And now, that lie shall be corrected. He turned slowly toward the man by the fire. The time has come to look at the shadow and see the man. Dr. Linley, up to that moment, the very picture of calm disinterest, stiffened as Poirot turned fully toward him. His chin lifted, his arms folded, but I noticed a slight tremble in the fingers, barely perceptible, but there. "Doctor," Poirot began, "you have served this household for many years. You are trusted, respected, a man of science, and yet—" Poirot tilted his head. "You have also become a man of secrets." Linley's face showed no emotion. "That's quite an accusation, Monsieur Poirot?" "Ah, non. Not yet. Not an accusation. Merely an observation." Poirot pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it up to the light for all to see. "You see, mes amis, in this photograph, unaltered, untouched, we find the truth. There is a man standing in the shadows beneath the elm tree, half obscured but visible. This man is not a stranger. He is you, Doctor. Linley." Gasps rippled through the room. Linley remained still. "Coincidence. Blurred silhouettes can resemble anyone." "Indeed," said Poirot, "except that you confirmed yourself to be wandering the grounds at that time. You said you passed by the study window shortly after midnight and saw Edgar dead. You claimed to have seen the light inside and looked in." He paused. "But if you were merely walking the grounds, why appear in the group photograph earlier that afternoon, lurking in the background?" "I didn't say I wasn't there during the photo," Linley snapped. Poirot smiled faintly. "No, you didn't. But you implied it. You let others assume. Because being in the photograph would place you near Edgar before the murder. Too near." Poirot stepped closer. "More importantly, the figure in the photograph is not moving. He is watching. Poised. That, Doctor, is not the behavior of a man strolling the gardens. That is the stance of someone waiting." Linley's jaw tensed. Poirot continued. "The revolver used in the crime was Colonel Wither's, stored in a locked drawer. Only someone familiar with the layout of the house, trusted enough not to be questioned, could access it unnoticed." A beat passed. Poirot's tone darkened. "You altered the photograph, Doctor. Or rather, you persuaded Mademoiselle Panswick to do so. Why? Because Edgar Molyneux saw you standing there. Perhaps he even spoke to you. And then, he wrote a letter, a cryptic farewell, a warning, a shadow from the past," he said. Poirot's voice rang out. "That shadow was you." Linley's face hardened. "You have no proof." "Non?" Poirot said. "You kept photographic chemicals in your bag. Odd for a physician. You contradicted yourself about whether the curtains were drawn. And the photograph you tried to destroy in the fireplace. Not Edgar's farewell, but your own undoing." He held up the recovered fragment. The torn corner of truth. Dr. Linley remained silent, but his hands were shaking now. Poirot's voice lowered. "Years ago, Edgar discovered your illegal experimentation. Unethical drug trials, wasn't it? You covered it up, but he knew. He kept it quiet, until now. Perhaps he finally threatened to expose you, so you silenced him." There was a long, breathless pause. Then Linley spoke, voice hollow. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him quiet." Poirot nodded gravely. "And in silence, monsieur, you found your guilt." For a moment, no one moved. Dr. Linley remained standing, his expression stony, though his shoulders had begun to sag with the weight of inevitability. Poirot, calm and composed as ever, stepped forward as though delivering the final act of a performance he had directed from the shadows. "It began, mes amis, not with murder, but with fear. A fear born years ago, in a different place, under different circumstances. He turned toward the group, his voice taking on that quiet, theatrical lilt I had come to associate with his most decisive revelations. "Dr. Linley, you once led a private research clinic, yes? A place where patients with rare and desperate conditions came to seek hope. And yet hope, as you well know, can be easily exploited." Linley's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Poirot continued. "Experimental treatments, untested compounds. There were rumours. You denied them. But Edgar Molyneux, an investor in one of your side ventures, discovered the truth. He uncovered discrepancies, records erased, side effects unreported, patients misled. He confronted you, demanded a full confession. You refused." The silence in the grand hall was absolute. Poirot's eyes gleamed. So he waited. Patiently. He held your secret like a dagger, unsure whether to strike. But when Eleanor Withers married Colonel Withers, the dynamic shifted. Edgar, once in control, began to lose that grip. And then he saw something, perhaps in Eleanor's eyes, or in his own reflection, and he decided it was time. Poirot gestured toward the hearth. He wrote a letter, not just to us, but perhaps others. A warning, a confession of sorts. "A shadow from the past," he wrote. "That shadow, Doctor, was you." Linley exhaled sharply, his face a mask of anger and exhaustion. "He threatened to ruin everything." "So you acted," Poirot said simply. "You watched him from the garden. You waited until the guests were distracted. You entered his study. And then," Poirot's voice dropped, "you silenced him, permanently." Gasps echoed once again through the room. Eleanor covered her mouth. Charles stared, open-mouthed. "And then," Poirot went on, "you arranged the scene, the revolver, the whiskey, the placement of the body. But the details, Doctor, they betrayed you. You overlooked the little things, the drawn curtains, the photograph, the missing fire, and the man himself." Linley's voice was dry. "He deserved it." Poirot gave a sad little shrug. "Perhaps, but justice, monsieur, is not yours to assign." Poirot stepped forward again, his expression now tinged with something colder. Satisfaction perhaps, but also solemnity. "And now," he said, "we come to the final curtain. The illusion of suicide, so carefully constructed, was just that. An illusion. But there was one final inconsistency I could not ignore." He gestured toward the Colonel. "Colonel Withers, your revolver was found by Edgar's hand. It had been fired, but the wound bore no gunpowder burns, no close-range bruising. Strange, non?" Withers frowned. "I assumed the bullet killed him. As did we all." Poirot nodded. "Until I had the body examined further, quietly, by someone less acquainted with Dr. Linley." He retrieved a folded document from his coat. The result? No bullet was found. And more intriguingly, no internal hemorrhage consistent with a fatal gunshot. The room stilled. Charles sat forward in his chair. Poirot's voice sharpened. "There was a bullet fired, but not into Edgar. It was fired into a pillow, used to muffle the sound, yes, but also to create the scene. A body posed, a weapon placed, a narrative written." Hastings beside me whispered, "Then how did he die?" Poirot turned slowly to the group. "Poison. A fast-acting compound introduced into his drink, or perhaps a capsule, administered shortly before the meeting in the study." He looked directly at Linley. "And who but a physician would know such a method? Would have access to the necessary chemicals? Would know the dosage, the window of effect, and the deception needed to make it all appear natural?" Linley said nothing. His lips were pressed tightly together, the muscles in his jaw twitching. Poirot nodded once. And thus, a suicide scene was staged to conceal a clinical murder. But it was, in the end, a shadow too perfect, too precise, too controlled. Poirot turned back to the rest of the room. And so, mes amis, the truth is laid bare. It was not rage, nor passion, nor greed, but fear of the past, fear of exposure that led to murder. The room fell into silence, broken only by the low chime of the grandfather clock. Poirot stepped back, folded his hands, and said, "The shadow has a name, and now it shall face the light." It was nearing midnight when the tension at Withers Hall reached its peak. The guests had not dispersed after Poirot's stunning revelation. Rather, they lingered in silence, scattered in corners like discarded pieces of a once orderly puzzle. Dr. Linley, however, had vanished. I was the first to notice his absence. "Poirot," I said cautiously, glancing around. "He's gone." Poirot did not appear alarmed. In fact, he glanced at his watch with the mildest flicker of satisfaction. "Ah, right on time." We moved quickly, exiting through the drawing room and out onto the gravel path that led to the stables. The night air had turned crisp, a fog rising like breath from the earth. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the sound of quickened footsteps echoed. Then, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Halt, sir!" From the shadows emerged a familiar figure in a long overcoat and bowler hat. None other than Chief Inspector Japp, lantern in hand, his constables flanking the path. Dr. Linley had barely made it to the outer gate before he was surrounded. "I thought you'd try something foolish, Doctor," Japp said dryly. "You should have listened to Poirot." Linley turned, breathless, his composure shattered. "You have no right—" "No." Japp raised a brow. "You were about to disappear in the dead of night, with a bag packed and train tickets to Dover in your coat. That's not the behaviour of an innocent man." Poirot stepped into the light behind them, his expression unreadable. "Non, mon cher docteur," he said. "Guilt has a rhythm. And yours? It quickens when the truth draws near." Linley said nothing more. As the constables led him back toward the house, Japp glanced sideways at Poirot. "You always wait until the curtain drops, don't you?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The theatre of murder, mon ami, it requires a final act. I simply allow it to play out." The following morning, Withers Hall had returned to its unnatural stillness, as though the night's storm of revelation had passed and left the grounds oddly too quiet. Hastings and I sat once more in Poirot's guest quarters, tea laid out, though untouched. "I must say," I began, stirring my cup absently, "I don't know how you managed it. There were clues everywhere, but none of them quite pointed to Linley. Not obviously." Poirot, adjusting his cravat in the mirror, offered a smile. "Ah, Hastings, but that is where you and I differ. You seek what is present. He turned, lifting a finger. "Seek what is missing." "Missing?" Poirot walked over to the desk and held up the now iconic photograph. The unedited version. The one that had revealed everything. It was not what the image contained that interested me most. It was what someone tried to remove. I leaned forward, puzzled. "You mean Linley?" "Oui, but more than that. You see, the photograph was not just a snapshot of a party. It was a composition of secrets. Everyone posed, smiling, visible. But one man, he tried to erase himself from it. And in doing so, he told me more than he ever could with words." Poirot tapped the paper gently. "The absence, the erasure, was the confession." "I suppose," I said slowly, "it takes a peculiar kind of guilt to remove your own shadow." "Just so," Poirot nodded. Linley understood the danger of being seen, but he underestimated the danger of being seen missing. He turned back to the mirror, brushing a speck of lint from his lapel. "It is often not the presence of a thing, Hastings, that solves the mystery. It is the silence, the shadow, the fear of discovery." I chuckled. And here I was, worried about red ink and torn letters. Poirot raised a brow. "Mon ami, never fear ink. It dries. But lies, they bleed through every page. Later that morning, as we packed our things in the guest quarters of Withers Hall, I found myself eyeing the infamous photograph once more, now creased at the edges, but still disturbingly compelling. Photography, I muttered, seemed so harmless. Just a memento, a bit of fun. I never imagined a shadow on a print could unravel a murder. Poirot, who was polishing his patent leather shoes with an unnecessary degree of care, let out a soft chuckle. "Mon ami, you are the eternal romantic," he said. "To you, a photograph is a memory, frozen in time. To me, it is a confession. The lens, you see, does not lie. But people, ah, always." I folded the photograph and slid it into the envelope. "Perhaps I'll take up photography after all. Seems rather exciting." Poirot paused in his polishing, lifting one eyebrow. "Only if you promise, Hastings, not to develop shadows you are not prepared to confront." I gave a sheepish grin. "I dare say I prefer shadows that stay in the background." "Exactly," Poirot said, standing with a flourish. "The shadows, they are safest when one does not attempt to illuminate them. For sometimes what you find is not merely a man, but a motive." There was a knock at the door. A footman had come to announce our carriage was ready. Poirot adjusted his cravat one last time, gave me a satisfied nod, and whispered, "Let us leave the ghost to the portraits, n'est-ce pas?" And with that, we descended the staircase, leaving the case behind. Or so we thought. It wasn't until the next evening, back in London, in the cosy clutter of our shared apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, that I discovered it. I had been sorting through my things, reorganizing the evidence from the case into one of Poirot's preferred closed files, when I stumbled across a second envelope Dorothy had handed me, an extra set of prints she'd promised as a courtesy. I had forgotten all about it. Curious, I poured myself a modest whiskey and opened it. There, among a handful of similar party photographs, was one I didn't recognize. The angle was different, taken slightly later in the afternoon, by the look of the shadows. Most of the guests were walking away from the scene, caught in motion, blurred by light and wind. But in the lower right-hand corner, there he was, not blurred, not hidden. Dr. Linley stood fully visible, half shrouded in the shadow of the elm, but unmistakably staring, directly into the lens. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't caught off guard. He was watching. His eyes, captured forever in that precise instant, bore an intensity that chilled me more than anything I'd seen in the investigation itself. It was not the look of a man who had stumbled into a photograph. It was the look of a man who knew he was being watched, and watched back. I turned the photo over. Nothing written on the back. No timestamp. No note. Just that stare. Poirot entered the room moments later, coat in hand, ready to leave for dinner. I held the photograph up silently. He took one glance, nodded slowly, and said, "The eyes, Hastings, they are always the last to betray us." He turned, adjusted his hat, and added with a smile, "Come now, let us dine. And next time, mon ami, perhaps you will point the camera elsewhere, eh?" We left the flat and the photograph on the desk where Linley's eyes would forever follow the light. And so, the shadow in the photograph was not merely a trick of the light. It was the echo of a guilt long buried, captured in a single, fleeting glance. Poirot, as always, saw what others dismissed, not what was present, but what had been intentionally hidden. The erased figure, the edited truth, the silence between the words, all revealed the heart of the crime. Because with Hercule Poirot, la vérité always emerges, no matter how deeply it hides in the shadows. As we sat down for our usual late-night cocoa, I couldn't help but glance at the photograph one last time. "Well, Poirot," I said, "I may stick to typewriters after all, At least those don't stare back. He smiled over his cup. Ah, mon ami. But sometimes it is not the machine, but the man who wields it that creates the danger. What do you think was the most overlooked clue that revealed Dr. Linley as the murderer? Was it the missing bullet, the altered photograph, or something else entirely? We'd love to hear your theory in the comments. If you enjoyed this classic Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more brilliant detective stories to life every week, and of course, stay tuned. The next case may be just a shadow away.